As Ian says, I'm from a media and communication background, actually, which means I feel a little bit out of my depth here, given the kind of professional philosophers we have here and political theorists. I do feel a little bit like a fish out of water to some extent. So I hope my talk doesn't reflect too much my lack of knowledge in some of those areas. And to be honest with you, having heard all the talks today, a lot of what I'm going to say is it touches on a lot of the things that have been discussed already. So this might end up coming across a bit of an overview. Hopefully I'll add something new. So, and apologies, I'm going to read, although I'll try not to read in too terrible a manner, but there's no way I can extemporise for this period of time on this. And it's quicker for me to read, otherwise I'll just start digressing. It's the end of a long day. Okay, so I'll begin. So I'd hope to come along here and use this opportunity to offer a clear and precise exposition of Simondon's thought and its relation to the contemporary situation in which we find ourselves. But in my attempt to do this, I found I ran into more problems than I could deal with. Interestingly, the question of politics, which this conference posed, has helped me identify some of the problems I've experienced in trying to think in a Simondonian manner about the technological changes we see today, especially those in my field of media and communication. The other terms that this conference addresses, culture and techniques, are ones that figure prominently in media and communication theory and actually are foundational terms in one of the key debates that helped form the discipline. This problem stems from one of the foundational debates for the discipline between what was understood to be Marshall McLuhan's technological determinism and Raymond Williams' cultural studies approach. McLuhan drew heavily on the philosophical aesthetics of form for his media theory. In the aesthetics of form, the general idea is that forms have their own independent history from that of the social and the political. The interesting move that McLuhan makes is to transpose the earlier distinction between the classical and the Baroque forms into making a distinction between different modes of experience that are conditioned by different media forms. McLuhan's notoriety as a technological determinist is due to the transcendence of technical change that are responsible for such formal developments. Now, in the area of media and cultural studies, the account given by McLuhan is famously countered by the work of Raymond Williams, at least in the British context, and the subsequent tradition of British cultural studies. One of the key ideas in the tradition Williams emerged from is that Western aesthetic culture is decaying as the relation between culture and religion dissolves. And so life is becoming meaningless, and it has no perspective for universal significance. Simondon offers a solution to that issue by pointing out the transition of universal thought from religion to social and political thought. Williams also identified a decline in aesthetic culture, and attributed it to the increasing importance of the market and consumerism. Of significance here is that Williams was completely opposed to McLuhan's claims for some form of technological determination on culture. As such, he read McLuhan as promoting an ideological representation of technology as a cause, in contrast to his understanding of technology as a cultural and social effect. The result of the latter, however, was to remove technical agency from cultural accounts. It is coherent. A classic example of this kind of thinking is what is called affordance theory. So although it may be noted that a technology is plurifunctional, it is always the case that it is human agents who choose what function a technology is utilised for, and also that all technologies are the product of human needs, purposes, and arrangements. In this picture, technology's role is always already subsumed to the cultural context. Therefore, we can categorise technologies regarding the capacities they have for their significance for culture. With technological causality thus tamed, the humanities scholar is free to situate all the action within the traditional cultural arenas such as text and discourse, ownership and identity. So what's this got to do with Simondon? First, Simondon offers a path between the opposition that McLuhan and Williams present. He's obviously not a technological determinist, as we've just been amply discussed today. But he does allow for technical agency. In contrast, it should be clear that Williams's cultural determinism is the kind of attitude Simondon opposes in On the Mode of Existence of Technical Objects, given it is a good example of culture constituting a defence system against technics. What I want to do in this talk is look at the schema Simondon sets out in the chapter entitled Technical and Philosophical Thought in On the Mode of Existence of Technical Objects, which presents a genetic account of the development of the modes of relation between humans and the world, developed from an initial phase shift into the phases of technics and religion. Now, this has already been discussed quite a lot today, and I probably won't dwell on too much of the detail of this, because when I wrote this, I didn't know if people had read this or not, and it seems everyone has, so it's fantastic. It's done my job for me. So what this schema helps us to understand is that culture is not just a process of selection and regulation, but a mechanism to balance the actuality of technical development with the virtuality of socio-political thought in the human world. However, the more I considered this schema, the more I realised that rather than having a satisfactory explanatory power, it raised some interesting, if worrying, questions for me as someone who has pinned their flag to the Simondon mast, as it were. I'll briefly discuss the schema before turning to these questions. So I've drawn out a little map of the schema. We start off, as you all know, with magical unity. And Simondon begins his schema of the relation between the human and the world with the concept of magical unity, which may strike us at first as a strange one. What Simondon's really getting at here is the kind of relationship that humans have with the world, or had with the world, prior to the division with the emergence of subject and object. For if we are to genetically track the emergence of subjectivity and objectivity, then it is necessary to ascertain the primitive ground from which they sprang. This is the kind of logic. It is the state of magical unity which provides this primitive ground, which Simondon describes as the human being bound to a universe that is experienced as a milieu, and this milieu is experienced in a basic way as a network of privileged places and moments, or key points, as he calls them. Importantly for what follows, these key points are comprised of a mix of both the objective real and the human. He describes them as like a knot between both realities where none can be separated. I won't dwell on the main parts of this schema too much, because I want to move on to try and think a bit beyond it. Anyway, it's a network of key points which is dephased in the phase shift of magical unity into religion and ground, the detachment of religion and technics, the detachment of figure from ground, as has been discussed today, and most of this is coming kind of from a Gestalt theoretical background. So Simondon, like a lot of other cultural theorists, actually is using philosophical aesthetics quite a lot in his exposition, but that's kind of another story, to be honest with you. And by phase, Simondon is not pointing to a temporal development, but to a division of being resulting in two opposed phases. Although, as we progress, it becomes clear that there is a temporal development to this as well. So it's a kind of temporal ontological diagram. In this phase shift, techniques are tools that are not fixed in space nor time, and thus become objective key points that are figural yet detached from the ground. And to be clear at this stage, Simondon is talking about technologies such as tools or machines that stand independently and aren't networked, but can be transposed from one situation to another. For example, a water pump or an engine. And in opposition to this phase is the phase of religion, where the ground powers become subjective by becoming personified in the form of the divine and the sacred. Thus, the religious phase is concerned with the subjective and focuses on the universal ground of experience, such as ubiquity and eternity. So generally speaking, then, the result of this primary phase shift in the human relation to the world is a split resulting in the modes of pure objectivity and pure subjectivity, both of which are detached from the world, free to be emphasised without being limited by the other. In the religious mode, transcendence becomes detached from the world, standing over it, preceding it, yet unknowable for mere subjects. In empirical technical investigation, the figural is detached from the ground, from the milieu from which it develops, and this is limited in scope for understanding that world through empirical investigation. Following this primary phase shift resulting in the religious and technical phases, Simondon describes a subsequent division of each of these phases into practical and theoretical modes. Right, I'm not going to go through these because it's unnecessary to what I want to get to. It seems that most of you read about this anyway. One key aspect of the shift is that the reticular structure of the magical unity is dephased, such that we have ground on one side and figure on the other. That is, the particular nature of the magical reality is broken, and, as we all know, it is aesthetic thought that emerges as a neutralizing tendency between techniques and religion and their practical theoretical modes. And importantly, this phase shift is linked to artisanal minor technologies such as tools. So following the first phase shift, which concerns the use of closed technologies and tools, Simondon describes a second phase shift, which corresponds to the development of network technological ensembles, such as those found in more developed industrial world. Simondon here has in mind the development of transport, power and communication networks and all that they enable. Their operation tends to work not just on the natural world, but also on the human world, via feedback effects on both the human and its environment, provoking adaptive and collective transformation. Technicity at this scale overflows the bounds of the intracultural, both in its environmental impact and in the manner in which it spreads across the planet, impervious to cultural resistance, due to the adaptive change it necessitates. Where the first phase shift was productive of empirical scientific naturalism as well as transcendental religious thought and describes the relation of these to the natural world, this second shift develops a technical thought that has turned to elaborating the human world, that is, understanding the human social world via technical operational schemas that can be managed, coupled with a corresponding development in the religious domain that produces the major global political movements, which are properly, Simondon describes as the functional analogue of religions, and that attempts to think humanity in its totality as defined by qualities and grand forces. So there's a kind of an essentialism to these, which he opposes, an anthropology, if you will. Again, there is a tension between these two phases and a need for a neutral point between them where unity can be achieved. There is therefore still an aesthetic quality to Simondon's thought on how to think human reality as the search for a stable relation, but now between religion, natural technology, human techniques, and political and social thought. Simondon is clear that aesthetic thought is not capable of providing the mediation necessary. This is because aesthetic thought can only address phases at the same stage, these phases here. So what's required is philosophical thought, which is needed to analyse the whole genetic progression in order to take part in it and fulfil it. So he stipulates a philosophical thought which, as it were, comes up with this whole genetic schema. It's philosophical thought he understands as this kind of genetic thought. Well, that's one part of what he understands by philosophical thought. And it's interesting, the notion of fulfilment, which links to, say, the work of John Dewey and other aesthetic aestheticians. I find more and more that Simondon's work is riddled with aesthetic concepts, and it's something I'm wanting to explore more in the future. So Simondon's proposal is that after the second phase shift, there is a requirement for philosophical thought to influence culture. This is where the kind of my schema diverges probably from Simondon's description, to be honest with you. I'll start making stuff up a little bit here. Okay? I'll be clear about that. This is where things are going to get more speculative, I guess, and where people will no doubt disagree with me, which is good. So the second phase shift is a requirement for philosophical thought to influence culture. This comes around during the, as it's been discussed several times today, during the development of industrial technology, what we call elsewhere major techniques. And culture here is understood as the normative, regulatory aspect of the social system. But there's been discussion today about different understandings of culture and Simondon, but that's the one I'm sticking with in this chapter. So it's in fact the stated aim of on the mode of existence of technical objects to argue for the necessity for the proper representation of technics in culture. This we all know. For Simondon, culture plays a regulative role on social systems, and a key problem for the industrial phase of technics is that it was being restrained by the norms developed under previous phases of technicity. So you've got new techniques but old norms. As he states, it is culture that is regulative and in which the circular link of causality between governing and governed consists. Its starting point and its fulfillment are the governed. The lack of socio-homeostasis comes from the fact that there is an aspect of governed reality that, that is not represented in this regulating relation that is culture, and that aspect is, of course, techniques. It is worth making explicit here the tension that is ever present in Simondon between regulation and invention. In some ways, Simondon's theory of technological and cultural development is radical in its understanding of the evolutionary potential of technological individuation and the requirement for it to keep developing. On the other hand, his writing can appear conservative, given that he also focuses on education and regulation as required to preserve social metastability. Although Simondon is concerned with societal regulation, one of the reasons is because it helps support what he sees as a more fundamental objective, that is, technology's ability to move beyond itself through invention, and the consequent evolutionary potentials this enables for humanity. If we revisit Simondon's archetypal figure of the technician, we get a clearer idea of the scope of this ambition. The technician's interests are not directly with the political, but with the utilisation of potentials in technologies that open up new paths of individuation. Simondon is clear that this process of invention is not performed in accordance with the regulatory norms of the society in which the technician works. The technician's concerns are with exploration in the sense of discovering new possibilities and new worlds. This kind of exploration occurs beyond the regulation of ethics and politics. Although it is in fact productive of new values and norms, which the explorer returns to the collective, thereby changing it. As such, there is a high level of indeterminism involved with the invention's introduction into society. So one obvious point to make here is that if the main problem Simondon is addressing is the adequate representation of techniques in culture, then this means that there needs to be a distance between techniques and culture. So although contemporary culture is often called a technoculture, at least it is in cultural studies, we hear this a lot, this is mainly due to the saturation of technology into everyday life. But this is not the same as what Simondon proposes, which is to instill in culture an understanding of the causal modalities of techniques and the ability to apply these to other phenomena, both technical and non-technical. The relation between culture and techniques is therefore asymptotic, with culture at any one time approaching a true understanding of techniques, but at the same time constantly being left behind by it as it develops. So in order for techniques to be properly represented in culture, Simondon maintains there needs to be a coincidence of techniques with a more universal mode of thinking. So there needs to be this balance between techniques and a more universal mode of thinking, which at the industrial stage is social and political thought. But how is this to occur? In On the Mode du Mode, the answer is that it is because of the reticular nature of the newer technologies that they tend to become more universal. That is to say, they lose the isolation and replaceable nature of tools, and as major techniques play a significant role in structuring cultural and social reality. At the same time, social and political thought has to work with this reticular structure because it is simply unavoidable for it to ignore the fundamental technological infrastructures underpinning modern life. And in doing so, it must forfeit some of the claim to religious-like universality. This correspondence of techniques with social and political thought is thus made possible by the reticular structuring of human and natural reality in a way analogous to magical unity. That's the payoff for Simondon, of course. This return to the reticular structure and thus arrival at an analogue of the phase of magical unity is a wonderful thing. Of course, it's the great redemption, I think, in Simondon's schema. With this resolution found in the reticular structure of both techniques and normative invention, we see here the kind of redemptive payoff for Simondon that we also see in McLuhan, another Catholic thinker, who understood the electronic media as returning humanity to a form of acoustic space after centuries of linear print media. Is there a collection? Catholicism, this kind of thought. Indeed, we find in several thinkers this occurrence of a crisis in aesthetic philosophy occurring in the 1960s. For example, Terry Eagleton in The Ideology of the Aesthetic interestingly does something similar to that Simondon does here. He asks us to imagine a time before capitalism, perhaps before the fall, quite way back, before the dissociation of sensibility, where the three great questions of philosophy, what can we know, what ought we to do, what do we find attractive, were not yet fully indistinguishable. To be clearer, Eagleton argues that during this period, the three mighty regions, the cognitive, ethico-political, and libidinal aesthetic, were still largely intermeshed. Of course, the reason Eagleton sets up this description of classical philosophical thought is to then chart its dissolution, the dissolution of the bonds between these different domains and the transition they undergo to become autonomous. Thus, knowledge detaches itself from ethical constraints to become science and lose touch with value. Morality loses its connection with the situated knowledge of being in the world and becomes self-branded. Blah, blah, blah. Anyway, Eagleton goes on to tell a familiar story that the problem is capitalism and postmodernism. In his narrative, there is a sense of despair. The left's ennui. The postmodern disavowal of key modernist themes and concepts. How can we think past capitalism? There is a sense of helplessness in the face of the vertigo of endlessly circulating ideas that seems to lack rootedness. So that's kind of Eagleton. It's a really interesting book, actually. Another thinker who tells a similar story is Mario Perniola, an Italian aesthetician who unfortunately died quite recently, who sees all the main strands of philosophical aesthetic coming to an end in the late 20th century, again around the 1960s, 70s, this dissolution of philosophical aesthetics as he sees it. All happening around the same time Simondon is writing this. So it's kind of an interesting kind of pattern. Perniola argues that in each of these conceptual fields of philosophical aesthetics, he identifies 5, I think, strands of philosophical aesthetics from their lineage in Kant and Hegel. He argues that each of these conceptual fields, life, form, knowledge, action, and culture, a turning point occurs in the 60s that transforms them. As such, his point is similar to Eagleton's claim that the postmodern, although he doesn't call it the postmodern, but it's around that time, marks a certain development in aesthetics. But Perniola is more specific in that he identifies the development in each of these main strands of aesthetic thinking. And in fact, his prognosis is actually somewhat more negative, and that he actually argues that with these turning points, contemporary aesthetics actually comes to an end. He says that's the death of philosophical aesthetics. In its place, we have politics, media, skepticism, communication, and deconstruction. These have kind of replaced philosophical aesthetics. You can disagree with that. I'm not putting this forward necessarily as something I agree with, but I find it interesting that there are these writers who are talking about the problem that aesthetic thought has with describing the situation. And of course, Simondon himself says aesthetic thought, we need philosophical aesthetics, thought is no good anymore. We need, with industrialization, philosophical thought. So I think that I find it interesting in this kind of pattern occurring. I hope that kind of makes sense. So Perniola writes, the self-destruction of Western aesthetic culture, which many had foreseen between the wars, takes on staggering acceleration after the 60s. The 5 turning points, politics, media, skepticism, communication, and deconstruction, are the aspects of the single crisis of Western culture that seems incomprehensible to those only concerned with technological progress and improvement of Euro-American living conditions. This is an interesting quotation, given that Perniola here identifies that there has been a critical self-destructive moment in Western aesthetic culture, and what's more, that each of the turning points that are identified all relate to concerns found in media and cultural studies, which of course became established around this time. What's more, the 5 turning points each related to the closure of one of the dominant strands of traditional philosophical aesthetic form. I found it striking that writing in 1958, Simondon already portends the crisis in aesthetic thought. He has already told us it's not enough. What we need is philosophical thought, if we're to balance the techniques of the human world with social and political thought in the age of industrial ensembles. But more importantly, it raises the question, can we be satisfied with this resolution, the resolution Simondon offers, the analogue of magical unity? Is this the end of history, if we take this as a historical diagram? What next? What comes next? And I feel Simondon was also starting to become aware of this as an issue, that cybernetics was leading beyond the industrial to the post-industrial. So the main problem, I'm getting to it. So the problem is, how do we situate within this schema a post-industrial stage, which is marked by more human-sized devices running on extremely large-scale infrastructures, as well as increasingly datafied and integrated technologies that are becoming more and more automated and running at speeds beyond our perception. Bit of a mouthful, but you know. And it's something that I think has been discussed already today. Reiterating points made by several people here already. So apologies for the repetition, but it's kind of nice to see that people are identifying the same kind of issues. Can we say that the post-industrial is merely the saturation of the industrial stage? Is it the saturation of this phase here that the resolution holds? Or does it require a further phase shift? And if so, what would that look like? It's going to get really upset people. I'll probably be upset myself when you want to critique it. But it's a kind of speculative kind of experiment. I'm not claiming to fill Simondon's shoes in any way, believe me. But I thought it was an interesting question to ask, because I think that's really what a lot of people have been asking today in a way. So I'd like to indulge in some speculation about this, and as I say, it's still kind of nascent. I'm still kind of thinking about this, or trying to. For the purposes of the talk, I've speculated this further phase shift, put down to post-industrial, if only because it makes it easier to explain some of the issues faced if we are to extend Simondon's schema. But I think we could identify symptoms that we may be on the cusp of a phase shift. Doctor diagnosis. Things are feeling a little bit odd at the moment. Is it perhaps the case that the return in social and political thought of far-right and left populism is a sign of the saturation of this phase? Or rather that our culture is out of time with our techniques, given culture tends to lag behind technical development? What are the answers to the current technical situation we find coming from recent populisms? Fully automated luxury communism? Someone's mentioned that already. The return of the leisure society? Or on the right, exit, fleeing to a tax-free libertarian monoculture under the sea or on Mars? Or perhaps an intensification of neoliberalism enabled by technologies that allow the penetration of the market into everyday life and previously public institutions. So if this is the case, that there is another phase shift required, our task is to take seriously the implications of the change in techniques. And of course, that's what Bernard is doing, I think, precisely. But we'll get on to that. So I'm going to spend the rest of the talk discussing aspects of these two phases in order to try to clarify what they might mean for Simondonian politics. So it's a bit over-ambitious, and hopefully you'll have lots of suggestions regarding them. I don't stray too far, I promise. So by reflexive technology, Simondon is referring to the varied modes of causality, conditioning and command of different technologies throughout history, and that can be used analogically to understand a wide range of phenomena. It is important to understand here that this is not an exclusively theoretical reflexivity, but as one might expect given Simondon's ecumenical motivation, it involves no substantial distinction between thought and act. That is to say that technical reflexivity, or reflexive technology, involves both the theoretical and the practical, the technical and the symbolic. The typology of the different modes of causality, conditioning and command that technicity has historically involved, Simondon calls technical schemas, and collectively a technique of all techniques, and includes such things as mechanism, pneumatics, and of course, cybernetics. In addition to the development of this reflexive technology, the integrated nature of network technologies means that unlike simple instrumental tools, they have an inescapable normative value. So, as Simondon writes, probably quite a famous quote, I think a lot of people have used this. One changes tools and instruments, one can construct or repair a tool oneself, but one cannot change the network. One doesn't construct a network of one's own, one can only connect to a network, adapt to it, participate in it. The network dominates and frames the action of the individual. It even dominates each technical ensemble. The network's polytechnic ability to bind together the natural, technical, and human world, the past with the future, means it becomes a site for the delimitation and manifestation of desires and action. As such, the networks take on more normative power as the internal resonance of human activity throughout technical realities become greater. Which is a quote from Simondon. This cannot help but be the case, because the technical networks relate not just to natural environments and to human environments, but also to one another. So the placement of a dam is obviously constrained by the natural environment, but also requires a transport network to enable its construction, as well as infrastructure for the distribution of electricity to feed the general grid, as well as communication networks for regulations. So infrastructure upon infrastructure, as it were. Such intertwinings of networks thus must also be the site for long-term social and political planning and control, as well as providing the material for new desires and norms. It's pretty obvious, really. Thus we see that with the reticular structure, the understanding of operations enabled by reflexive technology coincides with the requirement of social and political thought to deal with the normative aspects of technical ensembles. They coincide, that is, around multiple shared points of involvement, and this coincidence is what Simondon describes as the third domain of culture. Okay, so I'm going to move on to my speculative trans-individual polytechnics. I just tried to find as few words as possible to try and so I describe the endless list of words that Simondon uses. But anyway, it's catchy. So now I'm going to try and discuss a possible foundation for what I tentatively call trans-individual polytechnics. In this, I claim that if we are to argue for a politics in Simondon, it needs to include a recognition of the trans-individual as well as the description of polytechnics described in On and Demode. And of course, we've heard a lot about trans-individual today. Apologies, I'm going to repeat a little bit of this. So the development of subjectivity occurs for the individual with and through the collective in a process of orientation within its milieu via signification, and as such the psychic for Simondon is always actually psychosocial. Simondon distinguishes between two modes of relations that occur between psychic individual, the inter-individual, and the trans-individual. I don't know if you'll probably all come across this. Making sure that the trans-individual is marked out as a certain accomplishment. That's required for the resolution of a new problem that the psychic individual encounters, which is the disparity it finds between itself and that which exceeds it, both in respect to its environment, but also in respect to other psychic individuals. So the difference between the individual and the trans-individual relationship is that the former is unable to resolve this problem because it's a basic relation that goes from individual to individual, without penetrating them, Simondon says. Instead, the inter-individual relationship is understood as simple in that individuals relate to one another via the representations they have of one another as if they are fully constituted individuals. The individual relationship is one that is based on established norms and functional relationships. So it's kind of the kind of relationship that I have in a relatively stable social situation. In everyday life, as it were. And when there's a shared cultural understanding. Simondon also describes and includes in this description the relations often involved in labour, due to these relations being the result of a functional organisation imposed hylomorphically on a workforce, and by doing so is deliberately undercutting the importance Marx gives to labour relations. And I agree with what was said about problem Simondon has with Marx and capitalism. I do think that there's a real issue with how he interprets Marx, but that's not for now. However, as Simondon states, everything is not given in culture, and even in the most normative cultural circumstances, an individual will still eventually come to question itself. And it is through such reflexive questioning that the individual becomes decentered and is then in a position to individuate beyond the inter-individual relations towards the trans-individual. And the trans-individual relation develops in a double movement by connecting the interior of the individual, the emotional as specified by Simondon, to the exterior, the actions, and vice versa. This double connection is established across the group through the co-individuation of emotion and action. This individuation is thus clearly demarcated as psychosocial, insofar as what is being described is a relation that is constituted between two poles, in the sense that each, the psychological and the social, is just a description of the same social relation, but from a different perspective. For this reason, Simondon, continuing his habit of getting beyond dualisms, and also as part of his reformation of the social sciences via axiomization, questions the undertaking of psychology and sociology as separate disciplines. Okay. It is pertinent at this point to say that with the trans-individual, Simondon describes the modality of a collective individuation, but in no way describes a necessary route for its achievement. It indicates the metastability of a social situation that is charged and open for an inventive phase shift. Brian Masumi develops an effective politics from the idea of the restructuring of the social, in part through a transductive amplification of values through a trans-individual domain. He proposes that modulating bodies in a state of effective attunement are primed for the transductive cue of a singularity that enters the metastable situation. As such, effective politics requires the preparation for the possibility of an event that through sympathy, this is what Masumi writes, might lead to an effective contagion. The results of this reverberation are by no means certain. The metastable situation it disrupts could de-individuate into fragments or lead to a further coherent individuation through an event of invention. So Masumi restricts himself to using some recent political events such as the Arab Spring, well, not so recent now, but to illustrate these points, and calls for a proliferation of practices aimed at developing techniques of relation. I think Masumi's example is possibly a little bit problematic in that he talks about sympathy as the singularity, and he doesn't really mention any technological anything to do with technicity. But I put it out, that's how it's been used to try and develop an effective politics. Perhaps a better example of political transduction than Masumi's, not only because it involves technicity, and Simondon identifies the trans-individual with techniques explicitly in places, but also because it doesn't just indicate the political as revolutionary, is given by Simondon himself when considering the importance of groups whose influence spreads across networks in a transductive manner. So, in an essay, Naissance de la Technologie, he writes, "It is this type of action by horizontal spread which is the essence of contemporary hermeticism. Cybernetic schematism constitutes the clearest formalization. It is no longer a state monopoly or a collective force indefinitely expandable up to the real universality, but the establishment of a network of small groups, scientists and technicians, who think the future humanity in connection with the entire biosphere, with natural resources, resource materials and energy, and even with the larger cosmos." Hurrah! So there's some nice piece of eco-thought in there, which you don't hear much about in relation to Simondon. So this may seem quite a romantic image, though, given the preponderance of universal political ideologies currently in play today. I'm thinking of those around Trump and Brexit, as well as with Corbyn. But actually, if we look at projects such as the Large Hadron Collider, we can see it does have some contemporary resonance. Indeed, there are plenty of global and networked projects in the world today involving scientists and technicians concerned with humanity's future. The European and more global work on space exploration also being another example. Additionally, we might also suggest But this model is also descriptive to an extent of some of the platform corporations that dominate contemporary internet functionality, such as Google and Facebook. Of course, it is clear that such corporations are less likely to be truly interested in the biosphere and larger cosmos than with turning a profit, despite the values they purport to espouse. Freeing knowledge by Google, bringing people together, Uber, and connecting cities, and Airbnb, helping people feel at home everywhere. You're lovely. It is also noteworthy that Peter Thiel, who perhaps more than anyone frames himself as a Nietzschean technician inventor figure that one might expect in a Simondonian text, paints contemporary technical developments with the old brush of political ideologies. So crypto is libertarian, because it's decentralizing, and AI is communist, as it is centralizing. Thiel also, like many in Silicon Valley, argues that politics is actually a problem, and needs to be, and is being subdued by technology. That is to say that technology's socially transformative effects will solve the problems that face us in the 21st century. This is certainly not a Simondon-like gesture. Simondon doesn't describe technologies as either centralizing or decentralizing, but rather describes them in terms of openness and closure, and also in terms of the effects they have for invention or regulation. Although Simondon may have some sympathy with a view that politics may indeed be stultifying for Technics, his perspective is more nuanced than arguing for a technocracy. It is in the dynamics of openness and closure that perhaps we could identify one aspect of the political in Simondon. Sorry, just have a bit of water. As already described, Simondon's claim is that technical networks enable a closing down of the gap between Technics and universal thought through a coincidence or overlap. The two poles that overlap in the post-industrial era are, I contend, network groups feeding a dynamic ethics through the development of transductive symbolic forms, so a bit of a mouthful, but he covers a lot of ground, as a development of social and political thought, and networks of integrated technologies with an accompanying thought of a technics of all techniques, what Simondon also describes as objective symbolic formulation in imagination and invention. So Simondonian politics must be polytechnic. It must bind together the human, natural, and technical, and thus requires the use of philosophical thought, which we see brings together reflexive technology with normative thinking to inform culture as to the technical reality of the situation. I will look at some of the qualities of both of these phases, well, purported phases, as far as they can be distinguished given the unified network form. On the side of Technics, we've already mentioned the requirement for a reflexive technology. In short, this means the development of schemes of actions and values drawn from technologies, but also analogically applicable to explain other phenomena. Simondon describes these schemas as common modes of functioning or the regimes of operation in otherwise different orders of reality that are chosen just as well from the living or the inert as from the human or the non-human. In the article Technical Mentality, he describes two universal schemas of intelligibility, Cartesian mechanism and cybernetics, but he was also aiming for another with his own informational ontology. In Imagination and Invention, he also discusses the objective metrological symbolic formulation, that is the techniques of measuring and conversion through operation that are so important to scientific thought. So in an attempt to make explicit some of the norms I believe Simondon would argue as a requirement for an adequate technical individuation, I will propose a few keywords as a foundation for thinking the normativity of techniques. So, you know, these are open for discussion and disagreement, obviously. I think these words that I've got here, these keywords that I've got in, maybe help us to understand, well, personally anyway, what needs to be coming from here, and I maybe argued for a politics that does justice to technical individuation. I guess this is what I'm getting at. We've heard a lot today, I think, from Bernard Stiegler, who I think talks more on this side of things. regarding retentions and this kind of thing, the human side of alienation. But what I haven't heard much of today is Simondon's concern regarding the enslavement of technology or the appreciation of techniques. And we talk a lot about reflexive technology, maybe appreciation of it, but what does that mean? How can we make this more concrete for today's situation? I guess it's what I'm trying to start to think about. Having read a lot of Simondon, there's a lot of these words kind of reoccur when he talks about technology and what makes for a good technical individuation, as it were. So I'm going to try and talk a little bit about these words in relation to some techniques today and see if it helps at all, or maybe not. So, universality. The universal nature of the internet is perhaps a seeming commonplace, but from a Simondonian perspective, we should all be mindful of those who wish to impinge on this universality, such as those who argue against net neutrality, or standards that unfairly impinge on the universality and the transductive development of network technology. I remember Microsoft bringing out their own version of JavaScript some time ago, so that you can look at websites that were. And they also made their browser only understand their version of JavaScript. So you had to use their browser if you wanted to see websites using that kind of JavaScript. These kind of developments, an abuse of universality, so we could use these ideas politically to argue against them. As such, we need to be vigilant of those who try to override the universal standards for the operation of the networks that use the internet infrastructure, as well as those who oversee what that infrastructure consists of. Importantly, we should be mindful of maintaining the openness of networks for universal access, especially when it comes to those who have disabilities to prevent this. Plurifunctionality and openness are both important aspects of Simondon's account of the mode of existence of technical objects. These are both important for the development and concretization of potentials in technical objects, leading to further individuations. That technological developments remain open to further individuation is key for Simondon. Otherwise, they are likely to fall prey to hypertilia. In the era of networks, important questions we should ask in relation to these are: how do networks individuate, and what does it mean for a network to be open? A good example, which I use in my book, is the work of Jonathan Zittrain, a lovely little book of his called The Future of the Internet and How to Stop It. In this text, he describes how during the development of the internet, the openness and generativity, that's the word he uses, it's a nice word, that marked the early pioneers was closed down by the commercial closing off of software development separate to hardware development. This closing down is being repeated today by restrictions on app development by the companies owning the hardware, as well as restricting the sharing of data. This restriction on openness stifles the level of generativity a platform allows for amateurs, for example, to tinker and hack. This is also restrictive on the development of a general technical mentality in users and potential developers. The development of the web has been marked by a number of attempts at closure. That by Facebook is, of course, because of its dependence on advertising and the use it makes of the data it collects. So we see the emergence of new kinds of alienation. The closing of technologies to collective development, but also older forms of alienation are maintained, such as commercialization for profit. For media theory, it's true, we can describe much of what is happening in this area from the perspective of political economy. But what this approach misses is the technical aspect. That is, that it's not enough just to point to ownership as being the problem and situating the solution there. It is as much what ownership has done to the technology, how it has curtailed its openness and also its potential for further functional development. Thus, the issue with the British Cultural Studies approach that describes technology as socially and culturally conditioned misses precisely the very real issue of technics. Another example where Simondon can add to the debate is in relation to contemporary work on data. I loosely follow here Jonathan Gray's ideas around data worlds. The use of data to model systems is interesting, as it is an instance of representation, but also an example of how data can both regulate understanding as well as expand it. As such, the debate about data shouldn't be framed around just centralization or decentralization, but also about how it both aids the invention of new imaginaries, as well as enforces schemes of intelligibility. Simondon's informational understanding of causality as between determinism and indeterminism should make us wary of the possibility of data models shutting down potentialities, that is, enforcing hypertenuous. So I'm thinking about big data, how it models situations, and then by modelling in a certain way, closes down potentials that might actually exist in what's being modelled, if that makes sense. Another area of interest is understanding data collection and use as a collective operation. As such, there are initiatives around the development of open data that maintain standards and accessibility to data, plus a transparency regarding the conventions and practices of its use. As such, data can be understood as another area alongside work, language and technology, which has the potential to provoke trans-individual individuations. There are real questions we need to ask about how data has been understood via a liberal ontology whose focus has been restricted to questions of privacy and surveillance around individuals, and how this narrow political understanding of data needs to be challenged. A main concern should be around the openness of data for different functions and the maintenance of its openness for further and diverse uses, rather than the current trend that is for data to be siloed and restricted by platform companies. So we're still talking about openness, universality, transductivity. Instead, the contemporary norms around data tend to be shaped by the neoliberal recognition of the individual as consumer rather than citizen. This is nowhere more clear than in the various platforms that have come to dominate in digital capitalism. Additionally, we also witnessed the neoliberal marketization of previously non-market arenas, such as the creation of healthcare data sets, or the utilization of browsing and search histories to enable algorithmic decision making. A common response to some of these issues is that there needs to be education, so people, particularly the young, can learn to exert judgment about usage. Shannon Valor, for example, claims we need to cultivate a set of techno-moral virtues for the internet age. That is, an updated virtue ethics for the digital age, such as prudential judgment and developing good online habits. Although commendable, such responses fail to address the importance of technicity. What is required, I argue, from a Simondonian-inspired politics is to push for technical development that respects these key Simondonian ideas regarding openness, plurifunctionality, universality and transductivity. There may be others that probably are. I have no pretense towards this, which would also help us argue against the closing off of potential data uses by platform capitalism. Gray also describes the even broader possibilities of coordinating data at a universal level to make things amenable to measurement, monitoring, evaluation, analysis, and visualization across space and time in support of diverse political, geopolitical, eco-political, or political economic programs, from neoliberal fiscal policy to market creation, gender equality to tax justice, increasing biodiversity to strengthening democracy. So what he's getting at is, by having all this data silo, the potentiality of what it can be used for in all these diverse possibilities is being completely missed out on, and is, I would argue, against the kind of technicity Simondon argues for. Such ambitions don't necessarily have to align themselves with any one particular project, but they also don't foreclose the potentiality of data techniques for technical, social, and cognitive development. What's more, much of the important work being done to argue for the openness of data is by the kind of small groups of specialists Simondon describes that enable the transductive spread of such ideas. How am I doing for time?
Oh, carry on, sorry.
Are you sure? Don't want people to die.
Ah.
Drink speakers. I would say, talk a little bit about Metrion, because it's a kind of, maybe not clear what that means. I include the term Metrion, not because it is one Simondon himself uses extensively, but because I think it is descriptive of the attitude Simondon has regarding both technology's operation, but also the relation we establish with the world through it. In relation to Technics, Simondon uses the term Metrion in his article Technical Mentality to describe the good judgment required in the development of post-industrial networks, which involve smaller devices running on much larger networked infrastructure. Here, Metrion, good measure, as a translation from the Greek, involves the choice of making weaknesses in the system and this choice should be informed by technical mentality, not just dubious commercial aesthetic concerns, as we saw, for example, recently with Apple and the designed-in obsolescence of batteries through the operating system, basically. The operating system is set up to make older iPhones run down their batteries quickly, so people would upgrade. This is an abuse of Metrion, I would argue. The second use of the term Metrion involves the maintenance of the relation that humans have with the environment through the transductive chains of causality that technologies enable between different orders of magnitude. In this instance, it refers to the due measure between the operator and the natural material and the stabilization of this relationship through repetition, leading to the establishment of cultural norms. As such, we could say that this usage also falls on the side of social and political thought. Go back to one point to make here is that in the process being described, the establishment of the norm is led by the technical process. It is not the case that the logic of technology is attributed from the operator onto the technology, such as through instrumentality or affordance theory or political economy. It is something real in the world. It is a relation linking orders of magnitude which would not previously have communication. Simondon describes it as a kind of alchemy, which we mentioned earlier. As such, we see this clearly offers us something different to the traditional British cultural studies tradition that tends towards thinking of technology in terms of affordances. This operative description of the relation of man with world via technology is consistent with Simondon's brief outline of ethical action attaining value not from its accordance with a universal norm, but the effective reality of its integration in a network of acts, which is becoming. It is very much a question of a network and not a chain of acts, he says. Simondon, however, maintains a distinction between those technical operations that can be described through technical schemes of operation and those actions, both individual and collective, that are not operative but are founded on an emotional, affective relation to the world. So, more on this side, rather than this side, where trying to bring these two things together to really think about politics somehow. The account given of the modality of these actions is through norms and ritualizations. It is here we move more towards the left side of the schema. So one example Simondon describes in Imagination and Invention is how religious rituals structure the relation of work and leisure time by providing a system of compatibility between them. It is through culture that values can be integrated collectively to establish new norms, and also how they can lead to transindividuation, in the sense that they can disrupt and transform cultural resonance. This is one of the meanings of invention, not just how techniques can solve problems regarding the human relation with the natural world, but how it can instigate and solve problems in humans' collective reality. Thus, Simondon sees one of the roles of political thought to invent new systems of compatibility between individuals, groups, and techniques. He gives human rights and international law as examples of political invention that respond to an era's unique problems. So, this is invention on this side. These can be considered as symbolic forms emerging from the normative dimension. And he says, in every era, normative inventions operate a discovery of compatibility for modes of existence that had no meaning or insertion point in the previous normative structures. These axiological formalizations provide a way for us collectively to represent the physical and social world through a symbolism of the action that can be taught and propagated. That is, it provides a way to judge actions in comparison with one another, even if they occur in different contexts. So provocations for changes in norms are not necessarily exclusively a political matter. They can be driven by religious or legal frameworks, as well as political theory, and presumably technical development. So, in an attempt to draw some conclusions, if I can, I'm not sure I'm prepared for that yet. We can now hopefully understand that the twin poles of media and communication theory, the technological determinist and the culturally determinist, are both lacking in appreciation of the relation of technicity. If we are to identify politics in Simondon, it is not in the form of upholding a universal doctrine or mythology, as he calls it. Instead, it must involve the overlap, go back to this exciting room, overlap between the domains of norms and traditions coming from universal thought, which have the tendency for closure and regulation, with the open and inventive tendency of technicity. This is one significance of Simondon's ontogenetic account, that avoids the excessiveness of technological or cultural determinism. However, technology is not just inventive. Just to complicate matters, it can become regulatory in the social domain, and social and political thought can also be inventive. So that cybernetic circularity we see over and over again in Simondon occurs here as well. Thus, overall, what we find is a cybernetically inspired circularity where the contemporary aim for any political project, or what I'm arguing for, is the invention of goals or aims in the cybernetic sense that are open to invention, as well as providing enough regulation to retain the social as a metastable equilibrium. It is to balance a conservative tendency for stability and security with an inventive appreciation for what potentialities make possible. That is to say, fresh trans-individuations that point towards new humanisms. That is the invention of new forms of social regulation by bringing into relation and resolving incompatibilities between culture, techniques, and thought. I think that's it. Thank you.